He invited his ex-wife to his wedding to humiliate her, and the moment she stepped through those glass doors, every conversation in the room seemed to tighten. Crystal chandeliers spilled white light over polished marble, tuxedos, silk gowns, and smiles that were already sharpening into gossip. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. And if you believe dignity is the strongest revenge, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to her story. For a long second, Claire stood just inside the entrance, one hand resting on the sleek strap of her black clutch, the other holding the edge of a cream-colored invitation she had nearly thrown away 3 times that morning. It had been sent with his name printed in gold, his new bride's name beneath it, and a message so small and cruel it barely looked real. We would love for you to attend. He had not wanted her there to celebrate. He wanted witnesses. He wanted her to see the life he had built after leaving her behind. Inside the ballroom, his laughter rose above the string quartet like it still owned the air. Daniel Harrington looked polished, expensive, and completely certain of himself, standing near the head table in a perfectly tailored suit, his hand resting with casual pride at his new fiancée's waist. Across the room, old friends leaned in to admire him, to admire her, to admire the kind of future that always looked brighter when someone else had paid the price for it. Claire did not move at first. She remembered smaller rooms, cheaper meals, and the years when she had kept his dreams afloat with her own hands. She remembered packing boxes while he promised temporary. She remembered the way he used to call her practical when he meant plain, dependable when he meant forgettable. Back then, she had worn her sacrifices quietly, as if silence could turn them into love. It never did. A waiter brushed past with a tray of champagne flutes, and the tiny clink of glass seemed to wake the room to her presence. Heads turned. A few faces changed immediately, from curiosity to recognition, and then to that pleased, hungry look people wear when they sense a scene about to begin. Daniel saw her next. His smile did not disappear, it sharpened. He excused himself from the table with a slow, deliberate grace, as if she were an unexpected inconvenience he could still manage. "Claire," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "I was hoping you'd come. It would have been awkward if you missed my wedding." A soft ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, thin and polished, the kind that pretended to be polite. Claire lifted her chin. The light caught in the smooth line of her dress, in the calm of her face, in the steady way she held his gaze without blinking. She did not answer him. Not yet. Because some women arrive to beg, some arrive to cry, and some arrive with a stillness so complete that the room itself begins to feel its own mistake. Daniel kept smiling, but the smile had lost its warmth. It sat on his face like polished silver, bright enough to impress, cold enough to wound. He reached for the stem of his champagne flute, turned it once between his fingers, and let his eyes drift over Claire as if she were a memory he had already decided to misplace. Around them, the wedding kept breathing. A string quartet played something delicate and expensive. Forks touched china in soft, careful taps. The guests, sensing tension the way birds sense weather, leaned closer without pretending not to. Claire remained still near the entrance, her hands relaxed at her sides, her shoulders level, her expression unreadable. She had not come here to make a scene. That was what unsettled him most. In the years since the divorce, he had built a story about her that made his choices easier to live with. She had been fragile. She had been dependent. She had been the woman who could not keep pace with the life he wanted. Tonight, standing beneath the chandeliers in a dress that moved like dark water, she looked nothing like that story. She looked composed, rested, untouchable. One of the older guests murmured her name, and suddenly Daniel noticed how many people in the room still remembered her. Not because she had ever asked for attention, but because she used to be the one who remembered everyone else. She had sent thank you notes in her own handwriting. She had learned names, birthdays, favorite wines, small details that made people feel seen. Back then, while Daniel chased investors and praise, Claire had been the quiet center of the room, the person who made his life look elegant from the outside. He had mistaken that kindness for weakness. He had mistaken her silence for surrender. His mother, seated a few tables away, lowered her glass and studied Claire with a look that was harder to read than approval and softer than warning. She had never fully trusted Daniel's version of the divorce, and she was not the only one. Claire felt the room settling around her, that subtle pressure of old eyes and old assumptions trying to pin her in place. She had lived through that pressure before. It was one of the first things she learned after the marriage ended. People who had never carried her pain always thought they understood its shape. They were almost always wrong. Daniel took one slow step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make it intimate. "You should have called first," he said. "I would have arranged a proper seat for you." The words were polite. The meaning was not. Claire looked at the empty chair beside him, then at the woman in white at his side, then back at Daniel. The room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel expected shame, maybe an apology, maybe the old reflex that had once made her fold herself small so everyone else could stay comfortable. But Claire only let her gaze rest on him for one quiet second longer than necessary. It was not anger that crossed her face. It was recognition. She had seen this version of him before, the one that needed an audience to feel powerful. And she had already outlived him once. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a man in a dark tailored suit stepped into view, though most of the guests did not notice him yet. He did not hurry. He did not announce himself. He simply paused beneath the lights, one hand resting lightly at his side, his attention finding Claire with the calm certainty of someone who had never doubted she would arrive. The man in the dark tailored suit was not rushing toward her. He was not looking for attention. Yet the entire room seemed to tilt in his direction as if the lights themselves had recognized him first. Claire saw him before anyone else did, and something in her chest went still. Not because she knew his name, but because she understood the shape of his silence. It was the same kind she had learned to trust in the years after Daniel, the kind that did not demand space because it already belonged there. Daniel, still standing beside the bride with his polished smile and careful posture, had no idea what had just changed. He was still performing for the room, still measuring himself against the reaction he thought he deserved. "Claire," he said again, softer now, as if gentleness could rewrite the last few minutes. "If you came here to make a scene, do yourself a favor and leave with some dignity." The word dignity landed wrong in his mouth, cheapened by the way he used it. Claire did not flinch. She kept her hands relaxed at her sides, the hem of her dress still, her expression unreadable. Around them, conversations had thinned into whispers. A guest near the front turned fully around. Another lowered his glass halfway to his mouth and forgot to drink. The bride's smile had tightened at the edges, as if she had begun to sense that this evening was slipping beyond her control. Claire finally looked away from Daniel and toward the man in the suit. He had reached the edge of the ballroom now, where the candlelight touched the lapel of his jacket and softened the line of his face. He was taller than most of the men in the room, composed in a way that did not need announcing. In one hand, he held a phone he no longer seemed to be checking. In the other, nothing at all. That empty hand mattered more than the rest of it. It was a hand that had not come to bargain, not come to prove, not come to take. It had come to offer. Daniel followed her gaze, annoyed at first, then distracted, then faintly uneasy as he noticed the way even the staff had begun to straighten when the stranger passed. "Who is that?" he asked, trying to keep the irritation out of his voice and failing. Claire did not answer immediately. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the question to begin hurting him. Then she lifted her chin and said, "Someone who does not need to ask for a seat." It was quiet, almost kind, and that made it worse. The man in the suit stopped a few feet away. His eyes stayed on Claire, steady and warm in a way the room had not felt all evening. There was no urgency in his face, only certainty, as though he had spent all night knowing exactly where he would stand once she arrived. Daniel opened his mouth, perhaps to recover the room, perhaps to dismiss him, but the stranger moved first. He gave Claire a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement that did not perform. Then he looked at Daniel with the same calm expression one might reserve for a man who had already mistaken himself for the center of the story. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, measured, and unmistakably practiced in rooms like this. "You should not have made her wait." The sentence was simple. The effect was not. Every eye in the ballroom shifted. Even the music seemed to thin around the edges. Daniel's fingers tightened around his champagne flute. Claire stood perfectly still, the faintest line of emotion passing through her eyes, gone almost before anyone could name it. For the first time that night, she was not the woman being discussed. She was the woman everyone was looking at, and the difference was beginning to show. Claire did not move when the room began to breathe again around her. She simply stood beneath the chandelier light, her hands resting loosely at her sides, her face calm in a way that made Daniel look even smaller by comparison. That was the thing people never understood about women who had survived public humiliation. They did not always arrive with fire. Sometimes they arrived with control. Sometimes they arrived with the quiet, unshakable grace of someone who had already buried the version of herself that once begged to be chosen. Years ago, she had done exactly that. She had waited in kitchens with cold coffee, in hallways with folded laundry, in rooms where apologies were always delayed and never enough. She had made herself smaller so often that she had once mistaken disappearance for peace. But not anymore. Now she watched the ballroom as if she had stepped outside of it, as if the glittering glass, the polished floors, the expensive laughter all belonged to a life she had already outgrown. Daniel was still trying to recover his footing, saying something to the guests beside him with the brittle confidence of a man afraid to look shaken. His fiancée smiled too quickly, her fingers tight around the stem of her glass. The stranger beside Claire did not glance at them again. He only stood there, composed and unreadable, as though the entire room had been arranged for a conversation that was finally reaching its proper beginning. Claire felt the weight of that presence beside her, not commanding, not pressing, simply steady. It settled something in her chest she had not realized was trembling. Across the room, she saw the familiar signs of Daniel losing control in real time. The way his jaw tightened, the way he kept searching faces for reassurance and finding only curiosity. The way the guests who had laughed so easily a moment ago now seemed unsure where to place their eyes. He had expected a scene. He had expected tears, maybe a plea, maybe a shaken voice and a quick retreat toward the exit. Instead, he was being forced to sit inside his own silence. Claire let that silence stretch. It was not cruelty. It was simply time returning what had been taken from her. The stranger finally turned slightly toward her, his expression still calm. "You have been patient long enough," he said, low enough that only she would hear. Claire met his eyes, and for the first time all evening, something almost like relief moved through her. Not because the past was gone, not because Daniel had suddenly become irrelevant, but because she was no longer standing alone in the space he had tried to make unbearable. She had returned with poise, with distance, with a kind of strength that did not need to announce itself. And in a room full of people waiting for her to break, she was beginning to understand that staying still could be its own kind of power. The stranger did not ask for her attention again. He simply offered her a hand, steady and unhurried, as if the chaos around them belonged to a different world entirely. Claire looked at it for a brief moment, then let her fingers rest against his palm. The touch was light, but it changed the shape of the room. Daniel noticed first. His eyes moved to their joined hands, and for the first time his smile faltered in public. Around him, the guests began to shift, the soft murmur of conversation thinning into something sharper, more curious. Claire felt it all without turning her head. She had spent too many years learning how to survive a room by reading its temperature before it became dangerous. Tonight, the air was no longer dangerous. It was expectant. The man beside her was still facing the crowd, his expression composed, his stance precise, but there was nothing accidental about the way he stood. He belonged in expensive rooms. He belonged in silence. He belonged in the kind of power that did not need to raise its voice. Claire had once known a different kind of man, the kind who filled every space with noise and called it confidence. Daniel had always loved the sound of his own certainty. He had worn arrogance like a tailored coat, buttoned neatly over insecurity, and for years she had mistaken that performance for strength. But standing here now, beside someone who said almost nothing and needed even less, she could feel the difference as clearly as if it were written in the marble beneath her feet. Across the ballroom, Daniel took a slow step forward, then stopped when he seemed to understand that rushing would only make him look smaller. His mother said something under her breath. One of the guests glanced from Daniel to Claire and then away again, as if afraid of being caught choosing a side. Claire did not move. She did not explain herself. She did not offer the room the satisfaction of seeing her uncertain. Instead, she lifted her chin a fraction and let the chandelier light settle over her like a quiet crown. It was not defiance. It was composure. And composure, she had learned, could be more unsettling than anger. The man beside her finally turned his head toward Daniel. just enough to acknowledge him without welcoming him. It was a small motion, almost polite, yet it landed with the force of a closed door. Daniel swallowed. He had entered the evening expecting spectacle, expecting his ex-wife to arrive alone, dressed in regret, still carrying the old weight of everything he had convinced himself she could not live without. Instead, she stood in the center of the room with a calm that made the polished floor seem to tilt beneath him. He could no longer pretend she was an echo of the past. She was here, fully present, and someone important had come with her. Claire felt the memory of years pressing softly at the edge of her thoughts. The lonely apartments, the explanations she made for his moods, the long hours when she had made herself smaller so the marriage could survive his pride. None of that belonged to her anymore. That was the strange mercy of this moment. She did not have to fight for space. It was already being made for her. Then the stranger spoke again, his voice low and even. "Would you like to move somewhere quieter?" Claire looked at him, and something in his expression told her he already knew the answer. She gave a single nod. The man turned slightly, guiding her through the open space with a confidence so calm it felt almost ceremonial. Conversations parted before them. Heads turned, and Daniel remained where he was, watching the distance between what he thought he controlled and what he had already lost. Claire did not look back. Some doors, once crossed, were never meant to be reopened. By the time Claire reached the edge of the ballroom, the noise had changed behind her. It was no longer the sharp, confident laughter of people certain they were watching a woman fall apart. It had become something softer, more unsettled, the sound a room makes when it realizes it has misjudged the moment. She kept her face composed as the stranger guided her through the open space, his hand at the small of her back steady, but never possessive, a quiet presence that made every polished surface around them seem colder by comparison. The evening light spilled across the marble floor and caught the lines of his suit, dark and exact, while the guests turned in pieces, one glance becoming two, then four, then the full weight of attention settling in their direction. Claire had spent years learning how to disappear in rooms like this. She had learned to soften her voice, to lower her eyes, to make her needs small enough that they would not disturb anyone else's pride. That version of herself had been necessary once. It was gone now. The strange peace in her chest did not come from triumph. It came from distance, from knowing she no longer belonged to the old hurt that had once defined her. Daniel stood near the center of the room, still smiling for the people around him, but the smile had grown thin, stretched too neatly across his face. He was watching her now, and not just her, but the way the stranger moved beside her, the way people made room without being asked. Claire did not react to his stare. She did not give him the relief of a flinch. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, as if she were breathing cleaner air for the first time in years. The stranger stopped near a quieter section of the hall, where the music was softer and the candles burned with a steadier glow. He turned toward her with the same measured calm he had carried all evening, as though none of the whispers mattered more than the space between them. "You do not need to stay where you are not respected," he said, his voice low enough to feel private even in a crowded room. Claire looked at him for a long beat, and something fragile but unbroken moved behind her eyes. Not fear, not doubt, recognition, the kind that arrives slowly, like dawn through closed curtains. Around them, the room kept adjusting itself, chairs turning, glasses pausing midway to lips, conversations thinning into silence. Daniel's confidence was beginning to fracture at the edges, though he had not yet understood why. He only knew that the room was no longer following his lead. Claire folded one hand gently over the other, her posture elegant and still. No one had given her this strength. She had built it in silence, in the long months when she had been left to carry her own sorrow and still wake up the next morning. And now, standing beneath the chandelier light, she did not look like a woman waiting to be rescued. She looked like someone who had already survived. The stranger studied her expression, then gave the smallest nod, as if he had read the answer before she spoke it. "If you would like," he said, "we can leave this place behind for tonight." Claire breathed in slowly. The air smelled faintly of white flowers, polished wood, and expensive cologne, but beneath it all she felt something simpler, something she had nearly forgotten. Choice. She gave him a single nod. He offered his hand again, and this time she took it without hesitation. Their fingers met with quiet certainty, and the effect rippled through the ballroom like a secret passed from one table to the next. Daniel finally stepped forward, but only by a fraction. It was not enough to stop them. It was not enough to reclaim what had already slipped beyond his reach. Claire walked with the stranger toward the side entrance, her heels steady against the marble, her expression calm, her shoulders lifted with a composure that needed no explanation. Behind her, the murmur of the crowd deepened into a low, restless hum. Ahead of her, the doorway waited, bright with light and possibility. She did not look back. The past had once asked her to shrink. Tonight, she let it watch her leave. Daniel's voice reached her before his footsteps did, smooth and polished in the way only men who had always been obeyed could make it sound. "Claire, we should talk before this gets any more out of hand." The words drifted across the ballroom, catching in the hush left behind by her departure. Claire stopped, but she did not turn. She felt the pause ripple through the room behind her, felt every eye waiting for her to react, to tremble, to give them the ending they expected. Instead, she stood with one hand still resting in the stranger's, her posture calm, her breathing even, as if Daniel's voice belonged to another life entirely. He took a few steps closer, his expensive confidence sharpened by irritation now, the kind that appeared when a man realized the room was no longer moving with him. "You do not have to leave like this," he said, softer now, as if softness might repair what pride had already broken. Claire almost smiled at that. Almost. The same man who had once treated her silence like permission now sounded startled by it. Around them, the ballroom remained lit in warm gold, the chandeliers scattering light over crystal glasses and folded napkins, over faces turned sideways to watch a story they had already started to understand. The stranger beside her did not speak. He simply remained still, giving her the quiet space Daniel never had. That silence said more than any defense could have. Daniel's gaze moved from Claire to the man beside her, and for the first time, the calculation in his expression faltered. There was something unsettling about a presence that did not need to announce itself. Something worse than arrogance. Ease. The kind that came from having nothing to prove. Claire finally turned her head just enough to meet Daniel's eyes. Her expression was composed, unreadable, and that in itself seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. "You had years to talk to me," she said, her voice low and clear. "You chose not to." It was not loud. It did not need to be. The sentence landed with the weight of something long withheld. Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if every explanation he had prepared had suddenly become too small for the room. One of the nearby guests shifted awkwardly, and then another. A murmur moved through the crowd like a soft wind through tall grass. Claire looked past him, not with hatred, but with the distant calm of someone seeing a door close at last. The stranger tightened his hand around hers once, barely there, a steadying touch that asked nothing and promised nothing except direction. At the far end of the ballroom, a cluster of phones lifted a little higher. Someone had begun recording. Daniel noticed it too, and the irritation on his face deepened into something close to disbelief. He had expected an argument, perhaps tears, perhaps the kind of public unraveling that would make him feel powerful again. Instead, he was watching her stand still in the center of it all, untouched by the panic he had once been able to summon so easily. Claire's gaze drifted over the room, over the polished tables and elegant faces, and all the people who had mistaken her restraint for weakness. None of them were laughing now. Not really. They were listening. "I am done explaining myself," she said, almost to the room, almost to him. Then she faced the stranger fully, and the shift was immediate. Whatever uncertainty had clung to the air thinned at once. The man beside her did not need to claim her with words. He only looked at her the way a man looks at a choice he respects. "Ready?" he asked. Claire gave a single nod. No hesitation. No glance back. Just a small, sure movement that told the whole room she had already decided who she was becoming. Daniel's jaw tightened. He took another step, but the distance remained. He was still far enough away to understand the truth and too late to change it. The stranger guided her toward the side of the ballroom, not hurried, not triumphant, simply certain. The crowd parted again, slower this time, like the room itself had begun to accept what Daniel had not. Claire moved through that opening with her chin lifted and her shoulders relaxed, and for the first time all evening, the air around her felt lighter. Ahead, Beyond the glass doors and the amber glow of the chandeliers, the night waited with its dark streets and clean possibility. Behind her, Daniel stood in the ruins of a story he had assumed he still owned. And Claire, without looking back once, kept walking. The man beside Claire did not hurry her, and that, more than his expensive watch or the quiet authority in his posture, was what made her trust him. By the time they reached the side entrance, the ballroom had become a distant shimmer behind tinted glass, all crystal light, and stunned faces left to rearrange themselves. Daniel had stayed back near the center of the room, held in place by the same crowd that had once fed on his confidence. Claire could feel his frustration even without seeing it. She could almost hear the questions he would not be able to answer. But the night had already moved on from him. Outside, the air was colder, cleaner. It carried the scent of rain on stone and the faint metallic trace of city traffic drifting up from the street below. Claire drew one slow breath and realized how long it had been since she had felt a room release its grip on her. The stranger opened the door for her without ceremony, then stepped aside, giving her space instead of claiming it. In the soft spill of the exterior lights, he looked even more composed, as if he belonged to stillness itself. Claire did not speak right away. She looked at the street, at the black line of waiting cars, at the way the night seemed wider here than it had inside. "You were not supposed to walk in there," she said finally, her voice quiet but steady. He gave the smallest smile. "No," he said. "I was supposed to wait until you were ready to leave." That answer settled something deep in her chest. Not because it was romantic or dramatic or meant to impress. It was careful. It treated her choice like something real. Behind them, the ballroom doors opened and closed with muted intervals, and from inside came the soft rise of voices, the sound of people trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Claire turned her head only once, just enough to see the glow of the chandeliers through the glass. She did not look for Daniel. She did not need to. She knew exactly what he was doing now. He was likely standing still, watching the space where she had been, trying to decide at what point he had lost her. The answer was not tonight. It had happened long before, in smaller moments, in quieter betrayals, in every time he had mistaken her silence for surrender. The stranger guided her toward a sleek black car parked at the curb. Its polished surface reflected the city lights in a long, clean line. He did not open the door and push her inside like a man showing off what he owned. He simply waited, one hand resting lightly near the frame, his gaze on her face as if he understood that crossing this threshold mattered. Claire stood for one brief second before the open door. The old instinct to hesitate, to wonder if she was moving too quickly, tried to rise in her. She let it pass. Then she lifted her chin and stepped forward. The leather seat was cool against the back of her legs. The interior smelled faintly of cedar and expensive cologne, but none of it felt flashy. It felt intentional, like everything else about him. When he settled beside her, there was no rush, no unnecessary talk. The door shut with a soft, final sound. For a moment, neither of them moved. The city stretched out beyond the window in blurred ribbons of gold and white, and Claire watched the reflection of her own face hover over them, calm and unreadable. It startled her how different she looked from the woman who had entered that ballroom earlier, shoulders tightened, pulse exposed, waiting to be wounded. That woman was still there, somewhere beneath the surface, but she was no longer alone. The car pulled away from the curb in one smooth motion, and the ballroom began to disappear behind them. Glass, light, memory. Claire kept her eyes on the road ahead. The stranger said nothing at first. Then, after a silence that felt respectful rather than empty, he asked, "Did you mean what you said in there?" Claire glanced at him. "About leaving? About choosing yourself." The words landed softly, but they carried weight. Claire leaned her head back against the seat and let the question settle. In the dim light, her hands rested loosely in her lap, no longer clenched. "I think," she said, "I am tired of being the person everyone else needed me to be." A pause followed, quiet and full. Then he nodded once, as if that were answer enough. The car turned onto a wider avenue, the tires whispering over wet pavement, and the skyline opened ahead of them in long rows of illuminated windows. Somewhere behind those windows, Daniel would still be trying to recover control of the story he had lost. But control belonged to other rooms now. Other people. Claire had stepped out of his version of her, and the strange relief of that truth felt almost sacred. She looked forward, then slightly to the side, where the man beside her sat in patient silence. And for the first time since the night began, she felt no need to prove anything at all. By the time the car reached the quieter district beyond the downtown lights, the city had softened into long reflections and darkened glass, and Claire had stopped trying to measure the distance between the woman she used to be and the one breathing steadily beside her now. The man in the passenger seat did not fill the silence with promises. He simply let it hold them, warm and unforced, as the tires moved over the wet street and the skyline thinned behind them. His hand rested near hers on the seat between them, not touching, only close enough to be offered. That was somehow more disarming than any grand gesture. Claire kept her gaze forward, watching the pale ribbons of streetlight slide across the windshield. For years, she had lived in rooms where every word felt like a test and every pause like a warning. Tonight, no one was grading her. No one was waiting for her to shrink. She drew in a slow breath and felt it all the way down in her chest, the strange ache of relief mingling with something steadier, something almost like peace. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, calm, and careful, the kind of voice that did not invade a person's thoughts so much as make room for them. "You do not have to decide everything tonight," he said. Claire turned her head slightly, studying the line of his profile in the dim cabin light. He looked unhurried, composed, almost indifferent to the drama that had been left behind. But there was nothing careless in him. Every detail had the quiet discipline of a man who knew exactly what it meant to protect without possessing. "I am not used to that," she admitted after a moment, her fingers folding together in her lap before relaxing again. "Being allowed to just be." He glanced at her then, brief and steady. "Then consider tonight practice." It was such a simple answer that for a second she almost smiled. Not the careful smile she wore in public, and not the polite one she had used to survive crowded rooms. Something smaller, more private, real. The car curved onto a residential avenue lined with old trees and muted porch lights, and the world outside became quiet enough to hear the faint hum of the engine. Claire looked at the houses passing by, each one holding its own version of a life, its own locked doors and lit windows, and for the first time in years, she did not feel like she was standing outside of one. She felt like she was moving toward it. Beside her, the man looked ahead as if he trusted the road to take them where they needed to go. No one in the ballroom would have understood that kind of stillness. They would have mistaken it for restraint, for distance, for nothing at all. But Claire could feel how rare it was, how safe. And somewhere behind them, in a room full of bright lights and careful smiles, Daniel was still trying to arrange the pieces of a story that no longer belonged to him. He had spent too long believing that control was the same thing as love. Tonight had taught him otherwise. The kind of woman he had underestimated did not need to announce her departure. She only needed to keep walking until the world behind her became small. Claire leaned back against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment, not from exhaustion, but from the relief of no longer bracing for impact. When she opened them again, the street ahead glowed softly under the next row of lamps, and the man beside her was still there, quiet as a promise, as the night carried them forward into a future that asked nothing cruel of her at all. She did not look back.